The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
That's true. You're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry.
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide. All right, welcome to The Divide. We have here today Greg, and Greg is a journalist who covers religion in the Bible Belt, and he's been covering religion since the 1980s, and so we're real honored to have you here, Greg, and we're really going to do a little bit a different kind of podcast in that we're going to interview the journalist.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, guys.
And so really, we just want to start by asking you, what is your religious background?
Yeah, my religious background, I grew up in the Catholic Church in the Midwest. I grew up on a farm about an hour southwest of St. Louis. And historically speaking, my mother's side of the family was Catholic. My father's side was Pentecostal, Assemblies of God, which has its national headquarters in Missouri. In fact, my parents, when they got married, neither side approved of the wedding. The Catholics didn't want to go to the wedding because she was marrying a Pentecostal, and the Pentecostals thought it was horrible that their son was marrying a Catholic. So there was some religious tension there from the start that I was born into. But I did go to Catholic school for 4 years, graduated from the 8th grade, and was an altar boy. And so I think it's fair to say I was raised in the church as a Catholic. And that's my basic background, although, like I said, my father's side of the family, they were Pentecostals. So I had some awareness and experience of that. Although I was a little bit bewildered by the speaking in tongues when I was a child. Didn't really quite grasp that.
Yeah.
I may be skipping a few steps, and we'll go back and talk about a lot of stuff that you've covered over your career, I'm sure. But I guess the first thing that has jumped out to me has just made that I've just wondered about you is how has your work affected your religious experience? Or I'm sure it's changed over the years, but do you feel like the work specifically has made you rethink anything? I'm sure.
Well, I think my job kind of dovetails in really well with my personality and background, because I did grow up with this kind of mixing of religious traditions, so I kind of had to be aware of different traditions and how they interact. And when I became a journalist in the South, they asked me to cover religion, and I said, "Yeah, sure, I can do that." And
so you weren't motivated to cover religion when you went into journalism?
No, it was totally an accident. I just wanted a job, and I'd graduated from University of Missouri School of Journalism and was looking for a job, an interview with the Anniston Star. I had a lot of sports reporting background. I worked for them for a day and did a business story, so I was in the mix for a business reporting position and a lifestyle reporting position. And the managing editor just said to me, "Do you know anything about religion?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I think I know a fair amount." But I really had to dive into it with more gusto than I ever had. I had to broaden my horizons and learn all about the Southern Baptist Convention, about different varieties of evangelicalism, about fundamentalism, about Pentecostalism, and I also had to deepen my knowledge of Episcopalians and the Roman Catholic Church and various other things. For example, right after I took the job, I met Mother Angelica, who had just started an international TV station in Birmingham, Alabama, that eventually became the largest religious broadcasting empire in the world. But I met her very soon after it started, and really covered the rise of EWTN, Global Catholic Network. So I became very close with Mother Angelica and learned a lot from her, and covered the rise of her broadcasting network.
You know what? Just to interject, when my dad would come down and visit in this area in the South, he would make a point of going over to the EWTN. He was Roman Catholic, and for the Latin Mass. You know, then he'd go back to Minnesota, and he was a rock star in the family because they had all seen him on TV. You know,
that's right. That's right. Yeah, so that's, you know, really just instantly. That was in 1985. I met Mother Angelica, and I had to cover her operation from basically starting in a garage next to the monastery in Irondale, Alabama. And then, you know, I covered the Southern Baptist Convention, which was the largest religious force in the South. I went to the Southern Baptist Convention every year, got to know all the pastors of all the big First Baptist churches all over the South, so especially in Alabama. So I had to immerse myself that. And as far as the question of how did it affect and shape me, I think my personality kind of worked with that, because I didn't feel comfortable being a committed member of a church while also covering these churches. And so I kind of kept a distance and never formally joined any.
Were you going
church.
to some church before that?
No, I was not. I would not have ruled it out, but I decided that being a journalist who believes in the tradition of impartiality, I just didn't feel like I could be a practicing member of one faith and then fairly cover everything else, including the atheist movement, you know, which was becoming more a factor in the news and religion. So,
were you married? Are you married, or were you married?
I am married. Yes, I was not married when I started in journalism, but I am married now. Yeah.
So I can see that being a challenge, you know, to have a family and then also try to maintain that.
Yeah, I think that's true.
It seems to me, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, that probably a lot of journalists are lifelong learners, you know, and that's just a part of being an interested observer in whatever it is you cover. And it sounds like you are no exception to that. But you think that's the case for most religion reporters, or, you know, whatever the term is?
I do know. I have known quite a few who were, you know, committed to Judaism or committed to some other faith, and you know, that's their path. I personally did not feel that kind of a public, open commitment to a church or a denomination was a good fit for me. So I've maintained an aloofness about that. But you know, I would say in terms of journalism, you know, being a skeptic is kind of one of the tools of the trade. You really need a healthy dose of skepticism, but also you need some empathy and some sympathy with the people that you're covering. And so I've learned quite deeply the traditions and culture of a lot of religious people.
So what then would you say you were pretty much a pretty consistent theist or monotheist, or what were your views then when you at least were at the beginning of your career?
You know, I think that has evolved over time, but I think one consistent thing is that I've valued tradition, and I feel like things have been handed down to me that I did not appreciate fully at all times. And as I've gotten older, I've gone back to a fuller appreciation of that tradition. For example, you know, my father died when I was 4, and he's buried in the churchyard at a church that was founded by my great-great-grandparents. And it's basically out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of farmland. They donated the land for that Catholic church there. and that is the cemetery where a large number of my ancestors are buried. And I value that tradition in a way more now than I ever have, because I think things are handed down to you, and it's really a privilege to be a skeptic and throw things out. But in a way, sometimes you look back and think, you know, I was handed a gift here, and yeah, maybe I didn't appreciate it, and maybe I threw it out. But sometimes you come back to it and realize some of the things that were handed down to you. And I think that's true. You know, I know you've had a lot of guests on the show who were atheists, but who talk about growing up Catholic, for example. And then it's, you know, it's their privilege to denounce their faith later in life, of course. But I think there's a lot of people who have really benefited from the imposition of those values at an early age and a structure. It's kind of like Mark Twain said, a man without habits is like a sinking ship with no freight to throw overboard. And I think you can say that the same thing about being raised in a religious tradition. I mean, at a certain point, you may heave it all overboard. You know, you may view it as just ballast. But at least you had ballast to throw overboard when your ship started to sink, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a way that's a privilege that newer generations may not be getting. I mean, if you look at people like Alanis Morissette, Madonna, and Lady Gaga, who all went to Catholic school and, you know, were kind of loaded with this kind of Catholic imagery and stuff, it informs their life and their art, right? None of them, I don't think, would be a practicing Catholic today, but everything they do was shaped by that.
Definitely gave them a lot of ammunition, right?
Yeah, gave them a lot of ammunition. And you look at the Supreme Court. You've got 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Three were raised in Judaism and 6 were raised in Catholicism. So, I mean, there's something about the inheriting of that tradition from generation to generation that I think is very important. And sometimes I think of this newer generation that's not getting that, which I see increasingly, is definitely losing something. You're losing, in a way, a lot of the history of Western civilization. Bill, you teach the classics, and you know almost everything goes back to the Bible and Shakespeare. And, you know, it's a lot of people are growing up without that door into the classics, which is the church. The church has been a door into the classics through hymns, the scripture. In the Anglican or Episcopal Church, it's a door into Shakespearean language. You know, the Book of Common Prayer is basically the same era as Shakespeare. You know, it's a repository of this great classical literature. And the church is a door into all of that. And if you raise your children without any faith, without any structure, a lot of times they're not getting the privilege of throwing that out later if they choose to.
That's fascinating. I had thought of about 1 billion questions, but I think the one I really most want to ask is, do you think that any, I don't know if you cover non-religious humanitarian groups of any kind, but do you think any such groups have succeeded in replacing any of that in a non-religious way?
No. I do cover a lot of, for example, the Freedom from Religion Foundation makes the news a lot, and I cover them a lot because they will write letters of complaint to various schools and governmental entities about religious forays into the public square and complain about those, and oftentimes very successful in, for example, eliminating prayer before a high school football game or something like that. So I do cover that. I find it to be a lot of tearing down without a lot of building up as a corollary. I mean, it's like once you get to the point where you tear things down, what's going to replace it? And the answer is we don't know. Something's going to fill the void. And you know, our ancestors have worked for thousands of years to try and hand us down a and organized, systematic moral system. And
But do you
when
think
you
it's
throw that
do you think
out,
it's
what do you get next?
do you think it's tethered to belief in God? Or
Oh yeah,
can it
without
be,
a doubt. Yeah, I
okay,
mean, at least the one we've been handed down, right?
right?
Sure, it's tethered to a belief in God, and you know, if we're going to abandon faith, then we have to figure out where we're going to get our moral structure from.
Well, it sounds, Greg, like you wouldn't. At least you don't sound like you're saying that after covering after essentially doing what some college students do in like 2 months, where they quote study all religions and then make their studied decision
Right.
how they're going to spend the rest of their lives. It sounds like you, who actually have been covering religion for decades, that your experiences hasn't really been quite so disillusioning to the very roots of the idea that God provides a valid and beneficial framework, belief in God, to society, but that, yeah, you haven't, in other words, you haven't really been disillusioned about that, but it sounds like you've actually, if I'm reading you correctly, it sounds like you've strengthened in your position.
Yeah, I would affirm that, but also say that along the way, skepticism plays an important role, because there are abuses in the church, there are abuses in tradition, and skepticism is required to beat back blind obedience to things that no longer have value for society. And, you know, we have to find a way to find what's good in tradition and keep it, while being skeptical about the things of tradition that are not healthy.
What if you had to cite a concrete example of something that religion gives us that we can't get in some other way? Does anything come to mind? Because I know
Yeah.
my atheist friends are going to be asking, well, what is it exactly that we're, because I think
Yeah,
most skeptics are open
I'll
to it.
start with what I've mentioned before: custom, tradition, and ritual. When we're born, when we're married, when we die, every civilization throughout history has had ritual and custom and tradition about dealing with these momentous events. And you might even add in, puberty. If you look at coming to adulthood, there are rituals associated with that in most religions too. But religion provides a framework traditionally for those moments of life and death, a way of framing and giving meaning to things. And that is something that atheism would need to replace if it's going to push religion out of the picture. I mean, you can have funerals that are completely secular and make no mention of God or the thousands of year old traditions that we normally have had in relation to funerals. Same with births, same with weddings. You can go to the courthouse and get married, but a lot of people find more meaning in a church ceremony with the traditions of, say, reading the fantastic scriptural verses from the Book of Common Prayer and the rituals that have been tradition in the church for centuries. There's a certain richness there that's layered over the ritual that you get from religion, and we haven't found a suitable substitute for that outside of it.
What then is your specific view of Jesus or the Gospels or whatever? Do you see him as sort of a great teacher in this larger bucket of tradition? He's kind of in the pantheon of great teachers, or does he stand apart in some way for you, given your Catholic background and also Pentecostal background?
Well, yeah, that's a tough question, because that's really a central question that all Christians have to deal with. I mean, I define God and divinity in a different way than a lot of people. A lot of times you'll have, for example, an atheist may come on your show and say, hey, I outgrew the idea of God as an old gray-headed man with a long gray beard sitting on a cloud. I threw that out because I'm no longer a child. I don't need that anymore. And to me, those are just straw man arguments that are easy to knock down. But I define God as love. And I think of Jesus as, at least how Christians understand him, the ultimate expression of that love. And I don't get bogged down in the details. I just think that divinity and God and meaning are important concepts, and there are lots of ways that we give voice to those. You know, when I look at the complexity of human life in the world today and in the universe, and you think of DNA, the human genome has 3 billion pairs of DNA arranged in chromosomes, and everything, your eye color, the length of the type of your fingernails, everything about you is in that. That is so complicated and unexplainable. I don't think that science will ever be able to adequately explain how we got from rocks colliding in space to having human DNA. And so it does beg the question of, how did we get here? What do we mean? What's the meaning of life? And these are questions that I think science will always leave to religion and philosophy. It can't answer those questions. I mean, how do you answer how we became so complicated? If you're walking down the street on a sidewalk and you see a copy of Dostoevsky's or Tolstoy's novels laying on the street, and you pick them up and you think, well, you know, a genius wrote this. Well, that's the way I think of human DNA. It's just so unexplainable by chance of rocks colliding, and then all of a sudden lizards are crawling out of the water, and then, okay, now it's us. You know, here we are with this complicated DNA, and how did we get here? Can science really ever adequately explain that transition? And that's where religion and faith come in.
Wow, that's interesting to me, because it was a very similar to an argument Bill made on a recent episode we did. We kind of did an episode where we cross-examined each other, or a few episodes really,
Right.
and that was one of his sort of evidences he gave for why he believes the way he does about God. If I can jump into the role of the Christian for a minute, and you know, I think maybe especially an evangelical Christian might have quibbles, and Bill can correct me if I'm wrong, but with the idea of not getting bogged down in the whole details of Jesus, because I think that's, you know, the resurrection specifically is very central to evangelical Christianity. And I don't even, I'm searching for a question here. I guess I'm just thinking that if I were in my old mold, I would buck up against that. I would say, well, that doesn't sound right to me. But I'm not in that mold anymore, and I actually quite identify with the idea that this narrative and these traditions can be valuable in a way that, you know, maybe the absolute truth is you know, whether it's absolutely true or not in every detail,
Yeah.
doesn't matter.
And, you know, the question that Pontius Pilate asked of Jesus, what is truth? That comes in handy here too, because stories can be truth. And the story of the resurrection, I do feel truth in that. And it speaks to something in the human condition that is true. Now, when you get to the discussion of inerrancy of the Bible and whether something is literally true, there are gradations of argument there. But I believe stories are true and important. And I've had handed down to me thousands of years of stories that I value. You know, from from people who gave it a lot of thought, and I'm going to value many of those stories as true. Not everything has to make literal sense to believe it as true, I think.
Well, let me ask you then, sort of a little bit different version of what Drew was asking, that, because Christianity, wasn't invented by the Southern Baptist Convention or the Episcopalians, or even I dare say the Roman Catholic Church.
Whoa, whoa.
clearly, there's a historical foundation, and there's writings all through history. You're very familiar with them, I'm sure.
Right.
So obviously within the sort of orthodox line of Christian thinking that crosses, let's say, the stuff where almost all the denominations intersect, something like the resurrection, there's not a lot of controversy between the vast majority of writers across the tradition of Christian history, which is that the event was understood as an actual real event, that demonstrated Jesus to be the Son of God. So am I understanding you as saying it's really less than that? Or that's not a question you concern yourself with?
I agree with you that the weight of Christian tradition is that it is a historical event.
Yeah. Well, what I'm asking is your reaction to it. Are you saying that you don't really? It sort of sounds like you're saying you somewhat identify with this Christian tradition, but I can't quite read whether you're saying at that level you wouldn't identify with that sort of belief.
Well, yeah, I guess I don't really want to pin myself down on that point.
Okay. That's kind of a Jordan Peterson answer.
Mm-hmm. I mean, definitely fair. I guess, I was thinking about kind of losing my train of thought there. I did want to. I was curious to see if Bill would sort of push in on that further, but I wanted to take it in a completely different direction, and now I'm losing my train of thought. So
the other question then, given what you're saying, is, do you feel like it sounds like you're saying religion in general, but I think you're saying, Greg, that the Christian tradition, although you did say Shakespeare in the Bible, but anyway, I sense you're privileging that in some ways over, say, the Islamic traditions or the Hindu traditions. Is that correct, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
But I do think it's privileged in terms of our culture.
Mm-hmm.
In Islamic culture, of course, Muhammad has more of a privileged position.
Yeah.
I'm not discounting that, no. And
when
I
you
do
say you
think
don't,
everybody is entitled to, if Taoism is your tradition and your answers and your stories, then you're fully entitled to that. I would not feel compelled to dissuade anybody from the powerful legacy of their tradition.
I think
when
it's
you say
fair
you don't want to be, oh, sorry, go ahead, Drew.
I was just saying, I think it is fair for us to case this in the Western context, because that's what we're probably all most familiar with, especially Bill and I.
Sure.
Well, especially me, I'll say, but Bill's not, studying the classics has probably taken him a little further into that. But so in the Western tradition specifically, but you could probably say this for all religions. Do you, Greg, feel that there is just as much, there are as many problems as there are things to be clung to, traditions that have been intentionally, developed by our ancestors to inform us, but also comes along with baggage. What is would you agree with that? First of all, would you say there are definitely?
Well, I don't know where it fits on the scales of baggage versus virtue. There's clearly a lot of baggage, but also I think the benefits of the accrued cultural tradition and knowledge I would say, outweighs the baggage, and is necessary that we find a way to carry it forward, and through skepticism correct the flaws and unload the baggage, or like Mark Twain said, have some freight to throw overboard.
Let me ask you again about the resurrection, because I feel like interviewing a journalist, I can't just let you get away
Sure.
with that. No, I'm being sort of facetious, but when you say don't want to get pinned down, are you saying you do have a view, but you feel like it's probably better not to address that because of your role as a journalist, or because you've obviously had a lot of time to think about it, or are
Hmm.
you really just not sure what you just haven't really
Well,
got a
I think
pin
there are
anywhere?
a lot of things we can never know. I mean, I would put that in the category of we can never know what heaven is like or if heaven exists. We cannot know the divine knowledge. We cannot know supernatural things that are not of this world. And I would put that in that category. Just because cannot know something doesn't mean you can't have faith in it.
Mhm.
And but also I think it's fair to withhold um, your full faith in something that you can never know. Um, so I just completely respect everybody who has 100% confidence in the historicity of what's recorded in the Bible, um, and I have some confidence in most parts of the Bible, and yet I withhold judgment on some things, and that's an evolving position. I
Yeah,
don't know when I die, where will my position be on that? I'm not sure.
I
That
think
makes me
agnosticism.
that
Go
makes
ahead,
me
Drew.
really it just makes me really want to ask a question that I often ask theists. And the good thing is, Greg, you don't have to come down with you don't have to defend it, but the question is simply, what's so great about faith?
Mhm.
I feel like you don't have to answer it in a personal context, but I feel like you probably can have an informed answer from your studies and your
Mhm.
career.
Oh yeah, well I'll take that one on. I mean, the great thing about faith is that it invigorates and motivates people to do good on a vast scale worldwide. I mean, I have seen it on a local community basis, and one of the most moving things I've ever seen in my life is I stopped in at a little Baptist church in Blount County, very rural county, one Sunday morning, and attended the service and kind of stood at the back, not personally involved like I am a lot of times covering church services. And two teenagers had just died in a car crash that week. And the minister led a prayer, and the family came forward to the front of the church sobbing, families of both the teenagers, and everybody in the church came forward and put hands on everybody else, and everybody was crying and praying. And I was as deeply moved by that as anything I've ever experienced, because in this time of deep tragedy they had this sense of community that was comforting them. And that to me is the value of faith. It's like, holy cow, they have got people backing them up, and it's people who share a sense of faith, of community, of values, and they're there for each other. And that just blew me away. I'm still almost choking up when I think about it, being there that day. Um,
It
how
That's
strikes
moving
very.
it was.
It's very.
It's
I think.
something central to the human condition that was being addressed.
I think it's very. It's very powerful. It's certainly from my perspective. I can see how Drew and a lot of the atheists, the non-believers we interview, will kind of feel like, well, I mean, but if in the end, the basis of what gives them this comfort is just false, it's like a placebo. I mean, maybe sometimes placebos are good and other times they're really deleterious,
Mhm.
that is just, I can just imagine that's how obviously some people would respond.
No,
But
but even if you're an atheist, then your basic position is that there's no intrinsic meaning in the world other than what we give it, because everything happened by chance. So what the meaning that we give everything becomes supremely important, and these people have given something meaning, and it is true. It is true for them. It's the meaning they gave it. They imposed meaning on the world, or the meaning is true. Either way, they have their meaning.
Well, I certainly am not going to disagree probably too much with some of with what you just said there.
I don't think I would either.
Yeah, I think Drew would probably agree. Yeah,
and it strikes me that it's a more, what Greg's referring to, I think, is sort of a more central project to humanity than any, because when you're first talking about faith gives you sort of a motivation to do good for the world on a cosmic scale. I was thinking, well, so does, getting involved with a movement, be it civil rights or, anything that you would, want to march for. But this is not really related to an issue other than being human and dealing with being human and dying or being born or anything that happens along the way that you want to have
It's just
meaning.
the human condition of being born, living, suffering, dying, giving birth, being married, and having this kind of community of people who are in your boat with you and share what you're going through. And that's very powerful.
I think it's one of the reasons, Drew, that you and I honestly have maintained our friendship for so long with very different, frameworks for how we view ultimate reality, and even have with some of the influence of that on our values, is because I feel like we both have a sort of, we don't deny our sort of common humanity. So there's an automatic sense of, we understand to a certain degree our experiences and value one another and so on. I was going to say something a while back, Greg, about that. You triggered a thought in my head that a lot of mistake I think that Christians make, my fellow Christians, is that when they're talking about things like the resurrection or the biblical accounts, is that they tend to make it an all or nothing proposition, that either the Bible's inerrant, every single comma, is the truth, or by implication, even they seem to be suggesting it's all garbage, it's worthless. And I don't think that makes sense at all. I read Plato. I find Plato to be very compelling and interesting at many levels. And I think a lot of what, not a lot, but I think some of Plato's key ideas were true in some ways, as many Christians did when Christianity was first. A lot of the first converts were philosophers, and they incorporated some of Platonic thinking, or rather, they saw an alignment between a Platonic way of seeing some things and a Christian way of seeing some things, and so it seems to me that the way a Christian ought to be talking to people about the Gospels or the Bible is that it is still a really valuable book at many levels, or could be valuable even if only 75% of it is true. Couldn't it still have a lot to offer the world? And I feel like in some ways that proposition of it's either all 100% true, the Word of God, or it's by implication, again, it's garbage. Mm-hmm. What that does is it's forced in some ways, I think, the non-believing world to treat it like that it is garbage and we should get it out of our schools if it's not, since they don't believe it's 100%, the Word of God. And I think, and obviously I do believe in inerrancy. I do believe the Bible's true. Okay. But when I'm talking to people, I feel like I have to dispel them of this idea that, well, isn't it possible just like JFK's assassination, that the event happened, even though all the witnesses don't quite agree. In other words, the decision someone should make about something like the resurrection or other events in the life of Jesus don't have to depend upon whether you think all the witnesses, quote, agree. It helps where there's alignment and where there's agreement strengthens the case. But one doesn't have to jump all the way into inerrancy and make that decision before they evaluate the evidence. Anyway.
Right. Yeah, and almost every denomination devolves into these arguments over really things that are not essentials. You know, it's like the first Baptist church started in the early 1600s, and a couple years later, they had their first split. I mean, it's almost part of the nature of Protestantism that you argue over whether you baptize people by immersion or sprinkling, or here's how we do communion, and what does communion mean? Is Jesus actually in the wafer, or is he just kind of there in spirit? I mean, everybody gets bogged down in these arguments that devolve into different denominations starting. The splits, you know, the First Baptist Church spawns the Second Baptist Church. And everybody wants to argue about this. And, you know, sometimes it's just too many words and too much argumentation over things. And I think of the famous quote attributed to Mother Teresa that preach the gospel at all times, when necessary, use words. I mean, her way of preaching the gospel was, let's just do what Jesus did. You know, let's, he took care of lepers. I'm going to take care of lepers.
Yeah.
And that in itself, just doing that action, imitating Christ, becomes the basis of drawing people to the truth of your beliefs. People say, wow, why is she taking care of lepers? I mean, that's not in her self-interest.
Let me ask you, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, and I would say that, you know, for example, when I went to Catholic school, graduated from 8th grade at a Catholic school in Missouri, and my teacher in elementary school left that job after I graduated 8th grade and became a teacher at a school in Sierra Leone in Africa, and taught there for many years and was greatly revered. And I only found this out years and years later. After she died, I read an obituary of her, and I was just blown away by this. I mean, here's a woman who, you know, taught me. I still get compliments on my penmanship because of the way she taught me how to, you know, the letters have to reach all points on this 5-line paper. You know, everybody in that class had to have great cursive handwriting, and then she ended up being a missionary in Africa and teaching that same handwriting to children there. And I think back sometimes to what motivated her, like what motivated Mother Teresa. And it wasn't arguments over dogma or the particularities of how you do baptism or how you do communion, or inerrancy versus other styles of interpretation of the Bible. It's just they had a powerful story that was inspired by the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And that was the essential point.
So let me ask, this is probably the final question I have, and it's really for both of you, just to sort of check a way I would think about something like the resurrection to see how you guys react to this. Is I would think that a historian, say, or a historical analysis could look at the event and could use the same methods of historiography you use in every other event, and could conclude that it's likely the event happened, that it probably was something that we would normally qualify as miraculous. But I don't think that it's the historian's role to say that God, the creator of the universe, caused this event to happen. Like that would be attributing, that would be outside of the realm of what a historian could do. Would you guys see a problem with that kind of analysis?
I don't see an immediate problem with. I think your point is good about separating the two things, the event and the cause of the event. I have a little bit of a problem with a supernatural event being, you know, included in any kind of history, but just because there's no precedent. So I don't know how, I'm not 100% familiar with how historians work, but I don't know of any other examples of where supernatural events are included.
Well, even if you just list, just to be clear, I didn't really mean like a professional historian, although that's fine. I'm really just concerned about the average person who's just who, let's just say they've studied history and they know how to think about history. I just meant, isn't it legitimate that to do it that way? Greg, do you have a response to it? I'm just curious how you guys respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of am in the same camp with Drew on that. I mean, it's just not the job of a historian to categorize miraculous events.
Okay.
Historians are restricted to provable things.
And as far as the average Joe, that you were mentioning, Bill, I feel the same way. I mean, I do think for myself, I could separate the two, and it doesn't make it any easier for me to believe.
Well, how about if I say it this way then, that let me put it in a different light. Let's say it actually happened. Like we saw someone, they died, we know they were dead. The doctors concluded they were dead. This isn't like a Sherlock Holmes movie or something. And then 2 days later, they actually come back to life. We would describe that as miraculous, not supernatural. I'm not saying we're saying that we're concluding it's supernatural, but we would say it's miraculous in a colloquial way. Okay. Wouldn't a journalist be, they would have to report, right? That's what happened, even though it might seem like
you could report the testimony of that person. In fact, I have interviewed people who have claimed to have had near-death experiences and come back from the dead and claim they saw heaven, Jesus. In that sense, coming back from the dead is not unprecedented. But how do you define dead? I think a lot of scientists would say, well, if they came back from the dead, then they weren't ever really dead, because part of the definition of dead is you're no longer living, and obviously you were still living because you came back from the dead. So,
and maybe you're right in that sense, that's where the lines are, that have sort of, was it miraculous or not? Although I'm not even sure it's always the case, that I'm not really sure about the science of all of it. I was just curious, when I think of it in a modern sense, if something happened that appeared to be miraculous, you'd have to report it. So if 2,000 years from now, people are looking back on it and they say, yeah, apparently something really freakish happened, you can call it a miracle in the sense of the colloquial way. But I would agree with you. It's not the historian's role to describe it as a supernatural thing. But anyway, I was just curious how you would sort of go along with that analysis. I think that's pretty
historically something definitely happened, because within a century there were thousands upon thousands of Christians, within a few centuries it was the largest religious movement on earth, and it transformed the whole face of the planet. So in that sense, it is miraculous. And I think any historian would say, yeah, something amazing happened with the birth of Christianity. I mean, it still affects us. It's how we count time. We're in 2020, which is about 2020 years from the birth of Christ, roughly. They weren't completely accurate when they thought that up, but that's still the marker of time, and it's the marker of so many elements of our culture and society are defined by that event.
Drew, do you have a final question? I could easily talk for another hour, I think, with Greg, but do you have any final question?
I was thinking the same thing, and I was thinking, how are we going to wrap this up? Because this is what I wanted to say, and then I'll leave it to you, unless Greg has anything else he wants to say. But we always, on the podcast, we have a Christian come on and kind of Bill helps them make their argument, or plays devil's advocate sometimes. And the same thing happens when we have someone who is not religious or not a Christian. They come on, and I kind of, it's almost like 2-on-1 usually, one way or the other. And for the first time, I feel like I know that I identify with Greg a lot, but I feel like Bill probably does too. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there are so many. It's almost like Greg's the missing link for our little podcast here.
Yeah, I think it's a trivide in this case.
But it's interesting to me. So that's all I wanted to say. I'll leave it to you.
Which means, Greg, you have a better shot at making my case to Drew.
Well, I'm glad I complete you guys.
Yeah, that's great. Anyway, really, really nice to have you, Greg. Just can't
thanks
thank
for
you
having me
enough
on.
for taking time out of your busy professional schedule to come and interview with us. I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, TheDividebyiPUB. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.